subcomitè d'ètica de la Journalism Trust Initiative, que és una iniciativa que vol combatre la desinformació a la xarxa a través de l'autoregulació. Ha estat implicat precisament en iniciatives d'autoregulació de la premsa al Regne Unit i fa temps que el CIC el volia portar aquí a Barcelona i per una cosa o altra no aconseguíem fer-ho mai, però finalment ha estat possible i avui ens parlarà d'aquesta crisi global que avui tenim, que és el fenomen de les fake news i que amenaça fins i tot la democràcia mateixa. White es posarà el problema, però afortunadament també apuntarà solucions, cosa que en aquests moments de caos i de desorientació li agrairem molt. You can start, please.
Thank you very much. Is that better? There we are. Thank you very much. So I apologize, I'm going to speak in English. And thank you very much for the introduction.
They have your conference in Spanish too.
Ah, okay.
Well, at least, they have it.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm going to speak for a few minutes just to I want to talk a little bit about fake news, but I want to talk much more about what I think is the profound crisis that faces journalism today. And it's not just a question of a crisis for journalism, it's also a crisis for organizations like the Colegio or the institutions around journalism, but it's a profound crisis also for politics and for liberal democracies. And that crisis, in my view, can only be solved by a completely new vision of how we see the use of information for the future. And as part of that vision, I want to talk about why journalism is particularly important and why we need to support and strengthen journalism more than ever. 8 years ago, when I left the International Federation of Journalists, I established the Ethical Journalism Network. At the time, people said, ethical journalism, why is this? Why would you want to do this? And I said, I want to just focus on ethics, good governance, self-regulation. And why was that? It was because 10 years ago, the crisis in media was a complete crisis. Media had no money, journalism was being cut, there was a massive influence now of technology, and I was aware of the fact that because of this crisis, people in journalism and owners of media were failing to recognize the importance of protecting their ethics and their standards. Because without ethics and standards, journalism cannot survive. And therefore, that was why we set up the Ethical Journalism Network. Today, ethics, everybody talks about ethics. You can't move for people today not wanting to talk about ethics. Ethics of journalism, ethics of society, ethics of business, ethics of politics. Suddenly everybody is interested in ethics, and rightly so. But that is a demonstration of the nature of the crisis that has evolved and is evolving. The information crisis we have is based upon these developments, which I think are really, I want to talk about a little bit. The global information landscape is polarized, fragmented, and politicized. We have more capacity to talk to one another in an efficient way than we have ever had in human history, and yet we are polarized, we are fragmented, we are not talking to one another effectively. We have a crisis of public trust, disinformation, chaos, and confusion on the internet. We have more bias and propaganda and lack of responsibility in the exploitation of technology. The crisis, some people say, is because of technology. It's not. The technology is completely neutral. The crisis we face is because of how we use technology. It's the exploitation of technology for various reasons. Technology can be a liberating force, or it can be a force which is a negative force which can make societies worse and make our lives worse. And so therefore we have to look at why there is a crisis of public trust. Disinformation, chaos, confusion of the internet. Today the public does not know what to believe. There are two sorts of schools of thought in the public. There are those who will believe anything. The people who will believe anything they read on Twitter, anything they read on Facebook, they will believe anything, and they'll believe it straight away. This is a very dangerous thing. They can believe it without question. The second group of people are people who won't believe anything. They don't believe what they get on Facebook and Twitter. They don't believe what they get in Avanguardia or the CNN or the New York Times. They don't believe anything a politician says or is reported. They don't believe it because they can't trust it. So, and what is terrible, very often they will not believe or even listen to important, well-researched information that has been developed by journalists or academics, which is important to be respected and which should be listened to. And the best example is climate change. Probably the greatest crisis facing humanity today. There are still significant sections of the population at large who refuse to accept, despite the fact that 92% of the world's leading scientists have formed a consensus for decades now around the issue, still refuse to accept this issue. It means that everything we do can be subject to question. So, for example, this was a very recent story, the Notre Dame fire. Well, you know, within hours of the Notre Dame fire, there were already stories circulating on Twitter. Disinformation, fake news, this is a terrorist attack, the information is being covered up. We had on various feeds completely misinterpreted information or malicious lies. We saw the same at the Christchurch attacks. The Christchurch attacks in New Zealand, live streamed on Facebook. Here was a terrorist, a killer, a mass killer, who decided to use technology absolutely to get their message across. They live streamed the killings, they published a manifesto, and it was incredibly successful, what they did from their own point of view. One of the reasons was that it was circulated, despite the best efforts of Twitter and Facebook, it was circulated, live streamed constantly to millions and millions of people around the world. The manifesto was published by some media, mainstream media. It was downloaded. It was a fantastically successful propaganda exercise, thanks to the technology that was there, but thanks to the facilities to use the technology. The same was true in Sri Lanka. We saw exactly the same problem in Sri Lanka. There, the government decided to cut immediately social networks to stop them functioning and so on. It's not a good thing when governments decide to stop our means of communication. But the protests around the world, there weren't many protests around the world about the Sri Lankan government deciding to cut Facebook and Google and Twitter, whatever, because people realized it was more dangerous for society to allow those means of communication to continue than the threat that was posed by cutting them off. I would never trust a government in Sri Lanka to control my information flow, but it happened. And unfortunately, we live in a world where we can expect more of these things. That introduces the problem of politics that we have to deal with as well. We cannot have a discussion about fake news or information without Donald. The problem about Donald Trump and what he represents is that he calls into question the very values of civilized discourse and suggests that they have no place in his world of politics and so on. It's a dangerous position that he has taken. And we cannot underestimate the damage that this does. He has initiated globally a new form of politics in which truth has no longer any place to play, because you have to appeal not through the media directly to your base, and you need to use technology to do that. So here you have two problems. One is technology which can be easily exploited by extremists to create fake disinformation, deliberately to confuse people. And secondly, a new political class that call into question the liberal democratic consensus that has been created since the Second World War, and which has created a framework of values, human rights, democracy. And this is entirely called into question as a result of this new form of politics. Trump is not on his own. He represents a global movement. We see it in China, we see it in Russia, we see it in Turkey, we see it in Europe. Sadly, I think we see a bit of it in Spain as well. The fact of the matter is, a new form of politics in which truth, respect for values, respect for pluralism, no longer has its proper place. This is dangerous, not just for journalism, it's dangerous for society as a whole. The open information crisis that I'm describing, therefore, is not new. I've been in journalism 50 years, and in those 50 years, I know we've had this problem of the state influencing media and corporate power influencing media. What is new and what brings new chaos to us is this internet, which is liberating because it provides citizens' voice. It is absolutely right that citizens' voice is heard completely within the new journalistic and media system. But it's been accompanied by disinformation, the exploitation and use of technology in which that we have to live with. I believe that the question of the internet is not to portray the internet as in any way a threatening thing for us. The internet is an open door for us to be able to enjoy more freedom, more liberation in terms of our exchange of ideas than we could ever have imagined. The problem is it being organized and administered in a way that is going to assist both journalism and society? And we see through disinformation and fake news just one element of how the internet is abused in the service of either corporate power or the state. And when I talk about corporate power, I'm talking about, in particular, the influence now of the platforms, the social media platforms, the new technology companies who dominate the publishing landscape, the information landscape worldwide. So we have an intolerant and populist politics driving the news agenda. That's one of the problems we have. So I've just had an interview with a very nice journalist, very good journalist. And he said to me, should journalists give the voice, give the microphone to extremist politicians? Should we allow them to speak? Shouldn't we be saying, no, we don't want to hear it, it's too dangerous, it's bad for the public? That's a very easy option for journalists to take, and the wrong option for journalists to take. Journalism is about disclosure. Journalism is about providing information. The way that journalists have to deal with extremism is to not ignore it as though it doesn't exist, but to place it in context, to take information that is given from people in public life, even those we really disagree with, but to report it in context, to make sure that it is not published unchallenged, that there is information that assists people to understand this comment, these views, these outrageous statements, in the context of how it impacts upon the lives of others. And that's hard for journalists, but it's the thing that journalists have to do. The period in which we're living is the hardest period I can imagine for journalists, because it forces us to be ethical in a way that we have never had to do so much before. But today we need to, because we are constantly meeting politicians who don't want to talk to journalists. It used to be, in my day, everybody wanted to talk to journalists. They wanted to influence what's going on. Today, half the politicians don't want to talk to journalists. Why would you want to talk to a journalist? A journalist will ask you questions. A journalist will ask you tough questions. Why would you want to put yourself through it? No, no, no. Don't give interviews to journalists. Go straight to your base. Go straight to your audience. Say what you want. No one should, you don't want to be subject to questioning and so on. So we have an intolerant and populist politics. And then we have the media sustainability crisis, cuts in public interest journalism. This is one of the worst periods that we have witnessed over the last 20 years in journalism worldwide. We have seen the broken market models, meaning that journalism, you can no longer make money out of journalism. When I entered into journalism, it was a privilege because I got onto a sort of conveyor belt, and I knew that if I kept a job, I could stay on the conveyor belt, make quite a lot of money, and fall off the conveyor belt at the end of my career with a nice fat pension, and life would be good. It's not like that anymore. You can't make money out of journalism these days, or it's very difficult to do, and only a very small number of people can. So there's a problem for media sustainability, and there are cuts in public interest journalism, cuts in investigative journalism, cuts in investment in journalistic jobs. Journalists are notoriously badly paid. Freelance journalists have a very precarious existence. So we need journalism, but we don't have the money to pay for it. So how do we solve this massive crisis? And the third part of the trust challenge is here, I would say, is our big friends in the platforms. I think the major contributors to the decline of democratic values and the plunge and the descent that we have seen in falling public confidence in politics and in information is as a result of the big technology companies, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Apple, Twitter. They are self-interested and they have encouraged abusive use of the internet. How has that happened? Well, it has happened because they have used a business model which is based on not information of quality. They have developed a business model which is entirely based upon clicks, attention seeking. And this business model undermines the civility of the public sphere and the values of journalism. So it doesn't matter to Google and Facebook whether the information they provide is truthful or malicious lies, is healthy or is pornography, is hatred or is love, is war or is peace, is violent or is non-violent. For them, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is that it's popular, that people click to see it, because that will generate automatically the advertising which allows them to make their profits. The moment they impose restrictions, so we want quality, we have to take down the abusive content, we have to show respect to our children so we do not allow pornography to be made available, we have to avoid abuse and we have to avoid fake news. The moment we ask these companies to do that, it interferes with their market models and so on. So these companies are too big, they're too powerful, and they are reluctant to take publisher responsibility. Their business models undermine the civility of public sphere and the values of journalism. They are, in my view, responsible for the collapse of public confidence in civil information exchange. And I think they have a heavy responsibility. We have allowed profiteering of our private lives, our identity, our own information to create enormously powerful and rich companies, but at a great cost. And that cost that we have, all of us, are part of, we've contributed to, that cost is in the collapse of public confidence in democracy and values. And we have to find a way of dealing with that. One of the things I think we have to do is we have to say to Google and Facebook and Microsoft and Apple that you're too big. These companies are too big. Each of these companies makes every quarter of a year, $4-5 billion profit. Each one of them. There are 3 of them now which are trillion-dollar companies. The figures are almost impossible to think of. Facebook has been told it is going to face a $5 billion fine from the United States for its abuse of the privacy of its subscribers. $5 billion. That will not even cover, that will be about a quarter a profit they make in 3 months. When you have companies so big that $5 billion can be taken out of their pot and it does not even worry them for a second, then you have a massive problem. So we need to break them up. Facebook, for example, has 4 companies. It's Facebook itself, it has Messenger, it has WhatsApp, it has Instagram. Each of these social media companies are enormous and so powerful. Why should one company have such a big grasp and hold on things? I think that's going to change. They have to take on publisher responsibilities. They say we're not media, we're merely pipelines. We only just carry information backwards and forwards. That is not sustainable. That is not sustainable. They have to find new ways of dealing with it. So we have to find out ways of developing a new vision of media and journalism for the digital age. This is what I really want to focus on this afternoon. You want to talk about how we combat fake news. I think fake news and disinformation is an inevitable consequence of the sort of exploitation of technology that we've seen. The Facebook business model encourages fake news. It encourages disinformation. It encourages fiction. That's clear. The problem is we have to teach ourselves how to spot it, how to deal with it. Well, here are some ways in which we can teach ourselves in order to deal with fake news. Examine the source, check who the author is, look for supporting sources, examine where the URL is, where it comes from, check the date, is it satire, is it claiming to be the truth? What are the biases at work? And look for corroborating information. I mean, we have to teach ourselves and we have to teach the public. And you've talked about it today. We have to teach ourselves how to live in a world of confused and chaotic information. And part of it is learning how to check sources and facts as part of being able to deal with fake news. But we also have to look at how we can limit the exposure of fake news or abusive comment. So we need more action by technology companies, and we need regulation of platforms. The European Union has started doing this, and you will have heard today, the European Union in September last year agreed a code of conduct with the big companies to take action against fake news. Well, their first report in January was very disappointing. The European Union said it was completely opaque and unacceptable. They're not taking it seriously. However, recent events have shown that they need to do more. And so there might be some action in that. So limit the exposure of companies by getting technology companies to do more. For example, the technology companies struggled to deal with the fake news that was coming, well, the reality of the horrifying news coming out of Christchurch. It wasn't fake news, it was abusive information stream. They struggled to deal with that. But actually, they could have developed technology which would have made it easier. They would have just had to spend more money on developing technology. These companies employ a lot of very smart people, Probably some of the smartest people in the world work for the technology companies in developing technology. But they should be employing these smart people to stop the spread of misinformation. And that's one of the things that they have to do. We also need to have new laws. We need new laws on online communications to protect our privacy, to protect our copyright, creativity, and to protect our human rights. Because these are being abused by the way that the internet and online material is used. And we have to develop sustainable journalism. We have to find new ways of target funding for media that can be trusted. That's the first thing I want to say this afternoon, which is that we have a crisis. We need to begin to turn the tide on that crisis, and we can do that in a number of ways: by teaching ourselves how to deal with disinformation and fake news, by introducing new laws and controlling the internet companies, by creating a much more respectful environment, and by expecting of politicians more leadership in defense of democracy and democratic values in communication. The second part of what I want to talk about is about journalism, about the role that journalism will play in the future, not just in combating misinformation and fake news, but actually in creating a new framework for how we combat disinformation, but journalism, and why journalism matters. One of the first things we have done over the last few years is to remind journalists of some of their basic values. Journalism is pretty straightforward, but actually a lot of journalists, because of the crisis of information, have forgotten about why journalism is important. Journalism is not free expression. Journalism is not free expression. There's a confusion there. Journalism is constrained expression. It works in a framework of values. As a journalist, you can't write whatever you want, take whatever pictures you want, ensure that everything that you want is published. You can't do that because you work in a framework of values. You can't tell lies as a journalist, of course not, because you have to be accurate. You can't tell people to kill other people, of course not, because you have to respect people. That's part of your ethical values. You can't make mistakes and not correct them, of course not. As a journalist, you have to do things in a different way. If you were exercising free expression, you don't have to tell the truth. You don't have to apologize for mistakes. You don't have to be apologetic for offensive, insulting, even illegal information that you put on. That's what free expression is. Journalism is not free expression. It is the only reliable, independent, truth-telling stream of information in the digital environment, because of the ethics that journalists have. And those ethics are very straightforward. There are 400 codes of conduct in the world today in journalism, of which the Catalonian Colegio has got one, and it's on the website we have called accountablejournalism.org. And these are the 5 values of journalism. This is the framework. Accuracy. Journalists don't tell malicious lies. Independence. Journalists are not propagandists. They're not controlled by politicians. Impartiality. Journalists are looking for all sides of a story. They don't tell just one side of a story. They tell all sides of a story. Journalists show humanity. We are not racists. We are not promoting hatred. We are not promoting war. We are not promoting violence, one group against another. We have to respect our audience and our public. And finally, we are transparent. We say who we are. And when we make mistakes, we correct them. Now, I believe that these simple values can be used and developed, and I think they have to be used and developed. I think if we are to escape from the information crisis in which we find ourselves, we need to strengthen journalism. We need to find new ways of strengthening journalism. Now, I think journalism can be faster, more efficient, with more scope for understanding and improving the world. Indeed, today, journalism is using technology in ways which, most of us really don't understand. most of us don't really know about. Thousands and thousands of stories are being produced today by computers, by technology. They don't see a human being. Thousands of stories. Stories are being put together, being made up in ways which are very, very important in the public interest. I want to give you some examples in a moment about Reuters Tracer, QuakeBot. And we see it with the Panama Papers and others, where information has been made available and we use technology in order to understand that information and in the public interest to publish it. But we need to put people before clicks in the way we use and distribute computer-generated information. So I'm going to argue for, and we argue for, a new form of journalism, which I would call hybrid journalism. But let me show you some examples of what we mean by artificial intelligence. Here's an example. The Los Angeles Times. The Los Angeles Times has developed something called QuakeBot. This is a special little system, artificial intelligence. Every time there is a earthquake above 2.5 in California, this bot automatically generates information about where it is, what damage it can do, what are the streets and homes affected by it, and it is published within minutes of that first earthquake being published. So this comes out, it's called QuakeBot, and it's made instantly available for the public. The public can know within a minute what is happening, and they can respond to it and so on. It's an excellent example of artificial intelligence being used in journalism to improve the quality of people's lives. Here's another one. Doctors and sex abuse. Some journalist in doing health work in Georgia, in Atlanta, Georgia, in the United States, discovered that there were many doctors in the state of Georgia who were practicing medicine even though they had been convicted of sex offences. They were continuing to practice medicine and to see women patients, even though they had been convicted of sex offences. And they thought, what the heck? How did that happen? So what they did was they developed a special tool and got together 100,000 reports from right across the United States of medical inquiries, disciplinary hearings involving doctors. And using the tool they developed, they were able to extract information about doctors on where they were and who had been found guilty of sex offence. They found 10,000 examples of doctors across the United States working today, dealing with patients out in the open, even though they had been convicted of sex offences. And this was only possible because of the artificial intelligence and the computational journalism that they could use. So we find using technology in an intelligent, public-focused way will give journalists enormous capacity to tell stories on a scale that we have never imagined before. And this is why this question of using artificial journalism, artificial intelligence or computational journalism is very important. And we can also use it for self-regulation. And here in Spain, here is an example. You will know Publico. You know Publico? It's a good example. This was the paper. It's no longer a newspaper. You know that, of course. It has moved online. But Publico is using artificial intelligence for self-regulation and to provide transparent information to readers about the stories they're producing. They have developed a transparency tool. You know, when you read an article online, at the bottom of the article you will see there's the little bird for Twitter, there's the little F for Facebook, there's little icons at the bottom. On the Publico stories they have a little T, a little multicoloured T. It's for transparency. And if you click on that transparency logo, it will give you information about where the sources come from, who the author is, why the story is being told, what the values at work in the media are, where the supporting documents are, what the context of the story is about, the date of the publication, the place of the publication. And it comes out like this. And this gives you a percentage of transparency in the story. And they do this on many of their stories. And sometimes it's not 94%. Sometimes it's 40%. Sometimes it's 34%, because they don't have enough background information. But this is an important way of giving access to readers about how we work as journalists. And it's entirely done with artificial intelligence. And we're working with Publico to try to develop now to improve this, because there are some things missing from this which we think should be included, including if I want to make a complaint, if I want to make a complaint about this story, does this tell me where I can go, and so on. So this is going to be improved. So what I'm talking about here is that this is artificial intelligence working with social intelligence. Journalists provide social intelligence. We are human beings. We understand nuance. Computers can be very sophisticated, but they don't have the capacity of journalists to stand back and to be able to make decisions. Algorithms, data sets, and have a continuing problem of bias. Algorithms are only, and artificial intelligence is only based upon the data sets that are provided, and very often these data sets are biased. So we have to find a way of ensuring that the social intelligence of journalists controls and administers the artificial intelligence of computers. So journalism using new skills in an old framework of values. That is to say, we maintain the values of good journalism, but we use these new skills in a different way. And let me give you some examples of why journalism, not computers, have to take decisions. The human dimension at work. You know this picture, you know this story. Everybody knows this story. Here is one picture which tells one part of the story. The tragedy of a human death. It's full of pathos and pity. It's also undignified. It invades the privacy of the child. It's a painful way to tell this story. Here's another way to tell the story. Also, it has the child. It's painful, again. But there is then the adult figure, a sort of responsibility figure. But they are separated. There is space between them. So there is some distance. It tells a different story. And here is the story told again. It's the same story. But here is a story of human solidarity. This is a story which shows humanity. It shows the victim, but it also shows the human capacity to assist, to be there. So, who makes the decision about which picture to use, which story to tell? You cannot leave that decision to an algorithm or to an artificial intelligence. You cannot leave that decision to some computerized notion of values. You need sentient human beings who are able to stand back, make decisions, are able to select for the public interest what is the correct approach to take. So, there are lots of examples from our historical reflections. Is this inhumanity or is it news? How do you decide? Can we ask an algorithm to decide? Can we ask artificial intelligence to decide, should we publish this picture or not? You need a journalist. You need a human being who understands the context. And the context is, would this picture, one of the most awful pictures, it is a moment of death. If you look closely at the man's head, you can see the bullet coming out of his head. It's almost as close to a picture of the moment of death as you're likely to see. And yet it was published. Why was it published? It was published because of the context of the need for the public to understand the inhumanity of a war that was being fought in Asia. How can you get people to understand an issue as important as going to war and the consequences of war if you're not able to take a hard decision about whether or not to publish? Who takes the decision? An algorithm? A computer? Or a human being? It has to be. We have to understand the nuance that's built into the knowledge and expertise of journalists. And of course the most famous one is this obscenity. According to the Facebook algorithm, this was an obscenity. So it took it down, automatically took it down, the picture. And every time it was put back up, including by the Prime Minister of Norway, it was taken down by the Facebook algorithm. It took it down. And why? Because the algorithm was doing what it's supposed to do. It's a picture of a young girl. She has no clothes on. Take it down. That's the instruction to the computer. But the journalist is the person who has to make a decision to publish or not to publish. Is it obscenity or is it telling a story? Is this news or is it propaganda? Again, who decides? How do you make these decisions? So, this is why we need, for those who talk about artificial intelligence, computational journalism, we have to say at the control of this process must be journalists, must be skilled, trained journalists who understand the ethics and values of their profession. We need to prevent fake news by creating new values for communication. We have developed some 3 key values for public policy related to communications: accuracy, no malicious lies; humanity, respect for others, avoiding hate and incitement; transparency, disclosure, or explain if not. Anyone who's using the information landscape should be prepared not to tell malicious lies, to respect others, and to be transparent about who they are. That's not just for journalists, that should be for everybody. Finally, I just want to talk about ways in which we can make journalism sustainable. I'm working with something called the Journalism Trust Initiative, which is a self-certification process, which is to help media identify and benchmark their standards. We need to create trusted brands in journalism, and we need to ensure that those trusted brands are the ones that receive public support. In future, journalists are going to have to rely on support from public areas of support. It may be from philanthropists, it may be from donors, it may be from public funds, but we have to make sure that only trusted brands get that support. And here we have a model for sustainable journalism. Targeted funding for media that can be trusted. Finally, the building trust in ethics. I think we need a new global policy charter to guide states. I wonder if it's time for an IPCC for the net. Do you know what the IPCC is? The Independent Panel on Climate Control. The Independent Panel on Climate Control is not a governmental body. It's a body of experts. This body of experts has met for the last 20 years and been developing global policy related to climate change. Maybe we need the same thing for communications and culture. An international panel of experts to monitor what is happening in the information landscape, to make recommendations for the future and future policy, and to protect our information environment. We need practical tools for the media. We are working on tools on hate speech, reporting migration, reporting conflict, and we have a global data bank on self-regulation. You can find it on accountablejournalism.org. You can go there and you see what we are doing. And we have to have ethical training for digital newsrooms. Towards this vision of a trusted media, I think we have to strengthen journalism, and we have to show commitment to transparency, journalism of values, good governance, partnership with the public, and new networks for ethical, trusted journalism. And we're developing such networks in Turkey, the Balkans, and across Europe. I've tried not to be pessimistic, and I want to be optimistic. I think we can look forward to a much more positive an optimistic future. But before we get there, we have a lot of hard decisions to take about how we control the existing information landscape. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
I'm sorry I took so long. Thank you.
Jo volia preguntar sobre good governance. Exactly what do you mean when you say good governance?
What I mean is that when we talk about ethics, very often we only talk about the ethics of journalism. So we worry about how journalists do their work. I don't think that is enough. Journalists working in a newsroom are not isolated. They work in a system. There's a pyramid of journalism. At the very bottom of this pyramid are the journalists who work in the newsroom, the editors, the filmmakers, the photographers, and the writers. But at the top of this pyramid are the owners, the executives, the management, the board of directors. These are the people who set the moral tone for media. You cannot have ethical newsrooms if you have corruption in the ownership and the governance of media. So therefore, our argument is we want to promote ethics for journalists, but good governance for managers and owners. And that's one of the problems today in media. We don't have enough transparency in who owns media and how media are used. We need good governance. So good governance principles are an absolutely essential part of creating the ethical framework for news media and journalism.
How do you get that?
You get that by, I think, money, actually. In the future, media will be looking for financial support. They will need it. And I think that in order to become a trusted brand, you have to demonstrate, I think, three things. One, your journalists are ethical. Two, you have good governance in the management and ownership of your news media. And three, you are committed to self-regulation and effective self-regulation. So these three elements are essential for trust, a trusted brand. And in the future, I don't think news media or journalism is going to be able to survive without these three principles being satisfied.
And we might need a body, an independent body?
Of course. In order to, we need new structures.
The three things that you said?
We need new structures. For example, in the United Kingdom, in Britain, a recent report called for the establishment of a national public institution to provide money and support for local journalism, local newspapers, local radio. It called for the establishment of a special institution to provide money. So the question is, who gets the money? On what basis do you decide people get the money? Well, they should only get money if they have demonstrated they have ethics, good governance, and self-regulation, and that they are a trusted brand. So the reality is that in the end it will be money that will push towards the creation of a more ethical framework for journalism, because that's the reality. In the future, it used to be that ethics were something you only worried about in theoretical terms. Today, if you want to survive in journalism, you have to make ethics at the very heart and center of your business planning.
And you are developing that in Turkey and the Balkans, for instance?
Mm-hmm. We are working in the Balkans, in Belgrade. Last month, representatives of media from 30 media from 8 countries, the Balkans and Turkey, established a network for trusted media in the Balkans. And, they understand very well that if they have a future, they have to be creating trusted brands for journalism.
What are your views on the Julian Assange affair? And you think that the result could damage the freedom of expression?
Look, I don't want to get involved in a discussion particularly about Julian Assange, but I'm interested that he now describes himself as a journalist, whereas I remember very well he was very much opposed to journalists some years ago. I think Julian Assange has become an iconic figure in terms of the importance of whistleblowing and providing information which some people would like to be kept secret. I don't think at all that we should confuse the important work done by WikiLeaks in revealing information which is important for the public to know with what I would describe as the personal trauma and tragedy of Julian Assange. I don't think we should confuse these issues. I think action that is taken to try to stop organizations like WikiLeaks from functioning is dangerous for press freedom. I think that is something that we should be very clear about. But I think to get it confused with Julian Assange is a different matter. He has his own personal questions to answer regarding, for example, the complaints that were made in Sweden about his behavior. The question of extradition, the British government has said it never should allow extradition to a country which has the death penalty. Well, I think that solves the problem. That means there should be no extradition to the United States. But I don't particularly want to sort of get involved in a sort of discussion about is Julian Assange right or wrong, or is he the best person to represent press freedom, because I don't think that's the relevant question here. His is a personal case, which is very controversial. It's for him to answer where his responsibilities are. For us as journalists, the question is, how do we protect our right to gain information from public sources? And we need to protect whistleblowing, and we need to protect organizations like WikiLeaks, and therefore anything that is done to try to prevent that, we should oppose very strongly.
I was going to say something, but I don't remember it.
That's okay.
Sorry, I forgot. ¿Algú més? Té alguna pregunta?
I was trying to think an advice for Spain that you follow. And in Spain, actually, we have these little bodies, but we don't have a big one. So, I don't know, just an advice in general.
Well, I think the most important thing to do is really, I think this commitment to partnership with the public is very important. I think one of the things we should be doing, not just in Spain, but in every country of Europe, is initiating public debate, public discussion about information, use of information, what public policy needs to be, how we need to sort of interact with platforms, how we need to introduce coherent public policy to protect journalism, to protect the quality of information, and to protect people from online abuse. I think we have to be absolutely clear. Online abuse we've allowed racism, sexism, terrible, unacceptable things to become made routine online, to have children exposed to the exploitation of pornography in a way which is a terrible reflection of civilized societies. To allow that to happen, how did we allow that to happen? How did we allow ourselves to be drawn in to systems of communication which are so abusive? Women who are the victims of violence, women generally, women in journalism suffer a fantastic amount of discrimination and abuse and so on. I think public debate, we need new public debate about information policy, about the need to create streams of information that are reliable and trustworthy, and that means journalism. And that is really where I think journalism must play the leading role in winning back public trust, but also in creating a new landscape. And it means we in journalism have to stop complaining about how difficult life is and about thinking about what we need to do. Also, the important thing about the public debate is that we need a new form of politics. I think this is not just a journalistic question, it's a political question. Our politicians are guilty of seeking only propaganda. They just want to have propaganda in their favour. And we need more Democrats. We need more politicians committed to defending human rights and creating a non-toxic information landscape an essential part of a political vision for the future. This may sound hopelessly naive. I mean, the problem about it is that these are obvious things. You know, it's obviously the case. Traditional politics is collapsing in itself because it has failed to defend democracy. And because it's failed to defend democracy, people no longer trust it. And this seems to me to be an inevitable consequence. So we need to encourage a new form of courageous politics which will defend democratic values and particularly an open information landscape. And all of this should be part of this partnership with the public and a public debate. So I think I don't have solutions. I only have suggestions about how we can talk about the possibility of finding solutions.
According to the spread of fake news through the social media, you said that Facebook, Twitter, Google, etc., all those big tech companies, they are not making themselves accountable about the contents that the people upload in their networks. Recently, I was talking to a friend of mine who is working at Facebook. He's working at the Akbar Tower, and he's editing some contents that the people flag when they see it on the wall of Facebook, on the wall of Facebook and stuff. And I asked him, you know, well, this is what you do. So you see content, and he said, yes. People flag the content, and they say why this content they flag it, and my work is to monitorize this kind of content. They go, well, are you a journalist or something like that? You know, I'm not. So maybe just the point that there is someone behind the screen and trying to monitorize all those flag content maybe is the first step that Facebook is making themselves accountable. You have said as well before that especially on the Christchurch massacre, the Facebook and Twitter and all the networks, they try to shut down the footage because the killer did the streamed live the massacre, and there was nothing to do because it was a very short time and there was no time to pull the plug. But afterwards, do you think that maybe one of the parts that involve fighting against fake news is that these big technology companies, instead of calling themselves tech companies, they start to hire journalists and start to make newsrooms?
I mean, I think that's inevitable. I mean, I think they have to take publisher responsibility. They have only hired moderators, like the one you're talking about, because they've been forced to. They've been forced by the public and by the governments to hire people. They wouldn't want to do it. The last thing they want to do is to hire people to monitor what's going on. So I think they have to be forced to do it. But, you know, it seems to me there's a very simple way you stop the Christchurch massacre being live streamed. Well, or you can contribute to it. For example, in journalism, when we have live news in journalism, in most reputable journalistic places, it's not really live news. It's not live news. What it is, it's got a time lapse. 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds, just enough time for an editor or a director to check before it goes live. It's called live news, but it's not live news. And that is a very sensible thing to do. Why? Because it's ethical journalism. Ethical journalism is thinking journalism. And in order to be ethical, you need time to think. If you're automatically streaming information, you have no time to think. You have no time to decide, is this good, is this bad, should I do this or so? So what if Facebook, in its live streaming system, introduced a very simple algorithm which said, no, a 30-second time lapse or a 1-minute time lapse before that information goes into the system and then can be monitored, and then a minute later it can go live. That can be done. Why isn't that done?
That's what they actually did in the Oscars. I think that it was in 2009 or 2008, something like that. Because no, in the Oscars or maybe in the Super Bowl. They already did that in an Oscar ceremony, because in the Super Bowl that same year was when Justin Timberlake pulled the bra of Janet Jackson and showed the nipple. All the people say, okay, we're gonna broadcast the Oscars, but like with 1 minute of lapse, and everybody was like, this is censorship. So what's the...
Is it censorship? Would it have been censorship to stop the live streaming of the Christchurch massacre?
No, of course not. But I mean that there is not like, it makes like there is not a simple rule for every kind of situation.
Of course not. But if we put public interest first, it means we can develop the use of technology with public interest values. For example, we don't build theatres without fire escapes. We don't build cars without seat belts. Now, it's no accident. A fire escape doesn't make a theatre a better theatre in terms of its plays, and seat belts don't make cars go faster. But what these things do is that they say, in public life, we have the right to protect ourselves. Why can't we do that with information? Why is it that somehow, if we try to protect ourselves through information, it becomes censorship? Suddenly, we're not allowed to do it. We're not allowed to protect our children. We're not allowed to protect vulnerable groups from abuse because it's censorship. This shows such a lack of confidence in democracy and what we represent. And this collapse of faith and trust in our own judgment to be decent human beings has been encouraged by Facebook and co. Because what they've done is they've said, we're not interested in human values. We're not interested in decency in public life. We're only interested in making money through clicks. And the moment you give everything away in pursuit of that alone, then suddenly we are the ones who become victims. So I'm intolerant of this idea. It's absolutely not censorship to introduce protective measures to avoid abusive information being easily circulated. I just don't accept that. And I know my friends in the free press community in the United States will have an argument with me about it, but I've been arguing with them about it for 20 years, so it's not a problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's all right.
Anava a dir bona nit, moltes gràcies per haver estat avui aquí. Jo crec que tots hem reflexionat sobre coses ben interessants i seria bo que a partir d'aquí potser sortís algunes de les idees que s'han llançat aquí avui, que d'alguna manera es poguessin continuar i es pogués fer alguna cosa per aconseguir protegir-nos de nosaltres i a la societat de tots aquests dolenta manera de fer el periodisme i potser a través del Consell i del Col·legi de Periodistes podem seguir treballant per aconseguir avançar en aquests camins que l'Aidan ens ha explicat avui. Well, we are going to this.
Very good. Thank you very much.
And well, thank you very much for coming.
Of course.
And it has been very, very interesting, your exposition.
Thank you.
And we have learned a lot.
So have I. Thank you. Thank you. Very good. Okay. Thank you.
sindicatos.
Of course, I know.